Hello again, Jerry here. Before we talk about reefer madness, before the posters and the panic, let's slow down. Take a breath. What we're about to unpack isn't a conspiracy or a morality tale. It's paperwork, policy, and people. It's the quiet construction of a myth that still shapes how this plant is treated today. And like most myths, it didn't start with chaos. It started with calm, deliberate organization. Here at Canna Intel 420, our goal isn't to prove anyone wrong, it's to set the record right. We don't deal in folklore, we deal in evidence. We bring forward the forgotten documents, the overlooked hearings, and the bureaucratic mechanics that turned cannabis from a crop into a crime. This isn't about outrage, it's about understanding how systems use narrative to survive. Because once you see how the myth was built, you start to recognize how it's maintained. In the summer of 1930, the United States Treasury Department founded a new agency, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, or FBN. On the surface, it looked like a simple administrative reshuffle, an efficiency measure for a government learning to manage a modern economy. But the timing tells a deeper story. The repeal of alcohol prohibition was already on the horizon. Thousands of enforcement agents were about to lose purpose, and the machinery of moral regulation was stalling. The stage was set for a man who understood that fear could justify function. Enter Harry Anslinger. Appointed as the first commissioner of the FBN on August 12, 1930, he wasn't a scientist or a policymaker by training. He was a strategist, an expert at turning disorder into order on paper. Within months, he began framing cannabis as a narcotic menace, folding it into the same linguistic category as opium and cocaine. That shift wasn't scientific, it was semantic, and it carried immense weight. Once a word like narcotic appears in statute, it stops being vocabulary and starts being doctrine. America in 1930 was a nation fraying under economic collapse. The Great Depression had stripped away certainty and work. In that atmosphere, law and morality blurred into one language: control. Newspapers needed villains to fill their columns, politicians needed causes to defend, and the Bureau needed something to enforce. Cannabis, then called marijuana, in border state editorials fit the role perfectly. What began as scattered local headlines about killer weed and Mexican insanity soon evolved into a national campaign of fear, engineered not from the streets, but from the polished desks of Washington. Anslinger's strength wasn't evidence, it was orchestration. The Bureau had little legal authority to target cannabis directly, so he built a network of narratives instead. He collected and distributed lurid police reports, murders, suicides, alleged assaults, all loosely tied to marijuana. Those stories became the Bureau's ammunition. He mailed them to editors, briefed civic groups, and cited them in testimony until repetition itself created reality. To the public, it looked like a spontaneous groundswell of concern. In truth, it was a feedback loop authored by one office that had learned how to turn fear into funding. By the close of 1930, the transformation was complete. Cannabis had shifted in the American imagination from obscure to ominous. The change wasn't driven by new science or public health, it was administrative. The myth had found its architect. From that moment forward, the plant would never again be treated as neutral matter. It would stand as a symbol for America's deepest anxieties about race, rebellion, and control. Every institution that survives learns to justify its own existence. After the Bureau's founding, that justification became Harry Anslinger's obsession. By 1931, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was barely a year old, small in budget, vague in mandate, and desperate for identity. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 had already locked down opiates and cocaine. Cannabis, however, remained a gray area, legal in most states, untaxed, and poorly understood even within medicine. To the public, it wasn't a social problem. To Anslinger, that was precisely the opportunity. He needed a national issue to prove the Bureau's necessity, something visible, repeatable, and frightening. Cannabis provided the blank slate. In those early years, Anslinger began amassing a library of newspaper clippings, police reports, and anecdotal case files, each describing violent or bizarre acts allegedly linked to marijuana use. Many of these reports came from small-town police departments in Texas, California, and the Southwest, where cultural tension with Mexican immigrants ran high. To a bureaucrat trained in messaging, that prejudice was political currency, a way to attach a drug to an identity and an identity to disorder. Anslinger didn't invent racism in policy, but he understood its leverage. It was emotional, fast, and combustible. In his internal memos and later testimony, cannabis became the vocabulary of contamination, something foreign, corruptive, and invasive. This framing didn't appear by accident. America was drowning in the Great Depression. Unemployment bred discontent, and every federal bureau was fighting for funding. Fear, more than any commodity, kept agencies alive. By 1932, Anslinger was advancing what would become his greatest bureaucratic tool, the Uniform State Narcotic Drug Act. It wasn't drafted by Congress, but by the Bureau in cooperation with the American Medical Association and the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. The model statute encouraged states to align their definitions of narcotics, quietly inserting cannabis into that category. The brilliance of this maneuver was structural. The Bureau lacked power to outlaw cannabis nationally, but it could persuade states to do it piecemeal, creating the illusion of grassroots consensus. Legislators thought they were modernizing paperwork. In truth, they were volunteering for federal uniformity. At the same time, Anslinger cultivated his most powerful ally, the press. Major newspapers, particularly those owned by William Randolph Hearst, whose timber and paper interests opposed hemp, began echoing Bureau language in sensational headlines: marijuana, assassin of youth, killer weed, drug-crazed Negro runs amok. These weren't coordinated talking points, but symbiotic repetition. The Bureau provided material, the press sold fear. By controlling adjectives, Anslinger shaped a national mood. Scientific voices barely entered the conversation. The Depression gutted research budgets, and few physicians dared challenge Treasury authority. While cannabis still appeared quietly in the U.S. pharmacopoeia, its public image mutated faster than facts could correct it. Anslinger understood this velocity. If enough states defined cannabis as a narcotic, federal law would soon need only to standardize the consensus already on paper. By 1934, 26 states had enacted restrictions nearly identical to the Bureau's model language. This wasn't enforcement yet. It was alignment. Anslinger had built momentum without legislation, a country that looked unified before it truly was. The myth had evolved from rumor into policy scaffolding. Fear had acquired infrastructure, and within that structure, a new kind of storytelling was about to rise. While the Bureau worked the halls of government, another medium, film, was preparing to amplify the same message in light and shadow. The next chapter of the myth would not be written in reports, but projected on a screen. To understand the myth, you have to understand the man who needed it. Harry Jacob Anslinger was born in 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, a railroad town built on discipline and schedule. His father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, a company that ran on strict hierarchy and punctuality. It was a world where precision equaled morality, and mistakes were treated as character flaws. That environment shaped a man who didn't simply enforce rules, he believed in them. Before rising to federal power, Anslinger served as a railway police officer and customs inspector. Those roles taught him two enduring lessons. First, that corruption thrives in chaos. Second, that safety depends on control. These beliefs hardened into his worldview. He wasn't born a zealot. He was forged by order. And men forged by order often mistake obedience for virtue. During the Prohibition era, he worked within the Bureau of Prohibition, watching moral law turn into an industry of corruption and violence. When alcohol was re-legalized in 1933, he didn't see restoration. He saw proof that Americans couldn't handle liberty without restraint. To a mind like Anslinger's, freedom looked less like opportunity and more like entropy. He believed chaos would always fill the space left by law. He viewed addiction not as illness, but contagion, and difference as racial, cultural, or social deviation as instability. He came of age in a country that equated foreign with criminal, and by the 1920s that prejudice had already merged with moral politics. When he assumed command of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he fused that bias with bureaucratic power. To him, narcotics control wasn't a public health mission. It was a defense of civilization. Colleagues described him as tireless, severe, and deeply convinced of his own rectitude. His memoranda were terse, almost military, rarely emotional, always moral. He rewarded loyalty, punished hesitation, and surrounded himself with agents who mirrored his certainty. Beneath that discipline, though, lived fear. Anslinger feared disorder the way others fear death, and the instability of the 1930s fed that fear daily. His influences formed an alloy of Victorian morality, law and order ideology, and racial pseudoscience that flourished in early 20th century America. He read crime reports as moral parables rather than data. When he encountered stories of violence involving cannabis, he didn't analyze the context. He isolated the substance. In his logic, correlation proved cause. If a Mexican laborer or black musician appeared in a report, it confirmed what he already believed, that vice entered through outsiders. He began to speak of degenerate races and unfettered sensuality, wrapping prejudice in the language of protection. What he built was not enforcement, it was theology. He transformed his agency into a pulpit, preaching safety through obedience and salvation through law. By moralizing policy, he gave his bureaucracy a soul, and in doing so, he made it immortal. By the mid-1930s, Anslinger's conviction had become indistinguishable from institution. The Bureau no longer served the law now served the Bureau's belief. His fears had become frameworks, his opinions procedure, his faith a national policy. The myth was no longer an idea to him, it was proof of divine order. And soon, his conviction would find its reflection in something even more persuasive than any statute, a moving picture projected into the dark, showing America exactly what he wanted it to see. By 1934, Harry Anslinger was no longer just an administrator. He was becoming a crusader, the kind of figure who doesn't serve a system, but personifies it. Years of narrative building had turned the Bureau into a stage, and he stood at its center with conviction that bordered on divine calling. His memos, once bureaucratic, now read like sermons. He wrote of moral fiber, national character, and the preservation of civilization with the cadence of scripture rather than policy. What had begun as bureaucratic maneuvering, securing budgets through strategic storytelling, had evolved into something personal. Anslinger now saw himself as the final line between America's order and its moral collapse. Cannabis was no longer a substance. It was a symbol of corruption, a visible sign of social decay. To him, defeating it was not enforcement. It was exorcism. He had learned that fear alone couldn't sustain a movement. It required rhythm. He began managing public opinion like a conductor manages tempo, feeding the press fresh stories of marijuana crimes just as attention began to fade. Each new clipping sustained the illusion of escalation. Inside the Bureau, his office functioned less like law enforcement and more like an information ministry. Secretaries cataloged headlines by location and race of the accused. Agents were told to report any crime remotely tied to cannabis. The result was a continuous narrative that looked spontaneous, but was meticulously arranged. Anslinger's workspace reflected his mind, orderly, unbending, and controlled. In the Treasury building, he sat surrounded by neat rows of filing cabinets and carbon paper reports. Each morning he'd review incoming clippings and mark them with crisp penciled notes, forward to papers, request statement, send to Hearst. These annotations weren't just administrative, they were choreography. Anslinger was staging a national performance of panic. He wasn't reckless, He was precise. To him, procedure was truth. That discipline made him effective, but it also made him dangerous. Doubt was treated as disloyalty, and dissent was quietly transferred or erased. Under his command, the Bureau became an echo chamber of moral certainty, where obedience was integrity and data was faith. Outside Washington, Anslinger had begun mastering another language, performance. His congressional testimony grew more dramatic, less technical. He spoke in imagery rather than statistics, invoking stories of ruined families and drug-crazed youth. Marijuana, he told lawmakers in 1934, is the most violence-producing drug in the history of mankind. There were no studies, no verified evidence, but by then facts had become decorative. The story was what mattered. Meanwhile, the media industry was discovering the same secret. The Depression had made fear profitable. Publishers needed spectacle, and the Bureau supplied it. Editors like William Randolph Hearst, already fighting the hemp industry through his paper empire, recognized a shared incentive. The Bureau needed panic. The press needed circulation. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was convergence. By 1935, Anslinger's transformation was complete. He was no longer reacting to events. He was orchestrating them. He became a symbol of moral government, embraced by civic leagues, women's temperance groups, and religious organizations who echoed his rhetoric about youth and purity. His name appeared beside columns warning parents about marijuana madness. Each citation reinforced his authority until repetition became proof. By the time 1936 arrived, the groundwork was done. The Bureau had its narrative, the public had its fear, and the myth had its momentum. All it needed now was a new medium to project it, one that could reach the people faster than newspapers, more vividly than pamphlets, and with the emotional precision of a sermon. That medium was film. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a small group of moral reformers was about to give Anslinger's crusade its first cinematic gospel. If you could stand behind Harry Anslinger's desk in 1935, you wouldn't see policy. You'd see anxiety disguised as order. Outside his window, Washington buzzed with quiet desperation. Bread lines bent around corners. Jobless men sold pencils from tin cups. The optimism that once defined the American century had been rationed to memory. In that atmosphere, vice became a metaphor for decay, and law the last reliable form of control. To Anslinger, this wasn't an economic crisis, it was moral erosion. Jazz poured through radios, dissolving boundaries between races and classes. Hollywood, newly restrained by the Hays Code, toyed with sensuality under the guise of virtue. To him, every rhythm, every liberated image, was another crack in civilization's facade. He watched it all as a man convinced that one more indulgence could send the nation over an unseen edge. Where most people saw entertainment, he saw a contest for the American soul. The Hays Production Code, enforced in 1934, confirmed what he already believed. Morality could be legislated. If directors could be told what was indecent, citizens could be told what was immoral to ingest. For Anslinger, censorship wasn't oppression. It was proof that order could still be imposed. His thoughts blurred policy and prophecy. He saw the growing influence of black jazz musicians, Mexican laborers, and independent women not as cultural evolution, but as contagion, evidence that discipline was slipping. He wasn't malicious in his own mind, he was protective. He believed he was defending the fragile architecture of decency against chaos disguised as freedom. That belief, honest and absolute, made him both effective and unyielding. By 1935, cannabis had become his perfect symbol of decline, cheap, foreign, seductive, and mobile. It crossed borders, class lines, and genres. It was used by musicians, workers, and artists, the very communities he distrusted for their unpredictability. The plant frightened him precisely because it refused containment. To a man obsessed with order, its adaptability was rebellion. Inside the Bureau, his worldview became doctrine. Agents spoke his language, wrote his phrases, and carried his convictions into the field. Reports arrived from across the country written like sermons. Vice eradicated, community restored, youth protected. The language of enforcement had turned devotional. Every arrest was salvation, every confiscation proof of faith. The institution had absorbed its creator's psychology. And outside those walls, America mirrored it back. Newspapers printed the same stories the Bureau supplied, and public imagination filled the gaps with panic. The line between belief and propaganda disappeared. By late 1935, Anslinger's reflection was everywhere. In pulp headlines, pulpit warnings, and civic lectures, the country was preaching his gospel without ever learning his name. Then came cinema, a new medium, moral yet sensational, eager to prove it could educate while entertaining. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a group of reformers and church leaders was drafting a script they believed would save the nation's children. They didn't know it, but they were about to give Anslinger's myth its most powerful sermon, one that flickered to life in black and white. By 1936, the myth had a pulse. It breathed through newspapers, pulp magazines, and civic lectures, but it had yet to acquire a face. That year, it did, 20 feet tall, flickering in black and white. The film would later be known as Reefer Madness, though it began under a far more sanctified name, Tell Your Children. The project didn't originate from Hollywood ambition, but from moral crusade. It began with a coalition of church and civic reformers in Los Angeles, the Motion Picture Guild of the Church of Jesus Christ, who believed film could serve as a modern pulpit. They wanted a visual sermon, something that could be screened in church basements and auditoriums, warning parents of a new moral threat. Producer George A. Herleman and director Louis Gasnier accepted the commission under a simple understanding: make it instructive enough for clergy, sensational enough for crowds. The budget hovered near $100,000, modest but enough for spectacle. The script drew on two ready-made sources: tabloid headlines and Bureau rhetoric. For 6 years, Anslinger had been feeding the press a steady diet of marijuana crimes, murders, suicides, and moral ruin. The film absorbed those stories wholesale. Although Anslinger had no formal role in production, his fingerprints were embedded in its language. Terms like killer weed, assassin of youth, and madness beyond reason came straight from Bureau memoranda. What made Tell Your Children remarkable wasn't its exaggeration, but its accuracy in echoing official tone. The story of a clean-cut youth destroyed by cannabis mirrored congressional anecdotes and Bureau press releases. It followed the same structure: temptation, corruption, collapse, punishment. Every frame reinforced the equation Anslinger had spent years writing: disobedience equals chaos, control equals salvation. The producers marketed it as educational drama, meant to be screened before PTA groups, church assemblies, and civic leagues. But like all moral theater, its virtue came packaged in spectacle. The very panic it condemned was what sold tickets. Its actors delivered lines that bordered on sermon. Its score swelled like confession, and its imagery burned itself into memory. Laughter turning to violence, smoke curling into madness, innocence consumed by a single puff. The Hays Code had just redefined cinema as moral territory, and the film fit perfectly within those new boundaries. It preached restraint while indulging in the very transgressions it claimed to warn against. To reformers, it was a triumph. To the Bureau, it was validation. The campaign no longer needed to convince the press. The culture itself was doing the work. But morality and money rarely coexist for long. The film's rights were soon purchased by exploitation producer Dwayne Esper, who saw profit where the church saw virtue. He re-edited it, added lurid title cards, and retitled it Reefer Madness. The new cut traveled the country, shown in grindhouses and midnight shows, its hysteria exaggerated until parody became promotion. Yet, even as the audience laughed, the message endured. Fear had transcended tone. It didn't matter whether people believed or mocked it. The imagery lingered. Anslinger didn't see irony. He saw confirmation. To him, the film's success proved the danger was real. that America's imagination was now aligned with his mission. For the first time, fiction had become evidence. By the close of 1936, Tell Your Children had transformed from sermon to spectacle, but its moral remained intact. Chaos could be seen, controlled, and punished. The Bureau's language had become cinema, and cinema had become public memory. What came next was inevitable. The narrative that began as paperwork was about to become law. The film had prepared the nation. Congress would now sanctify the myth in statute. The lights dim. The final frame fades. For a moment, the audience sits in silence. Then the chatter starts, soft, scattered, uncertain. Some laugh at the absurdity. Others whisper that maybe it's true. They leave the theater not knowing they've just participated in a rehearsal. By the end of 1936, the story had already been accepted. The villains were drawn, the victims recognizable, the savior in uniform. The Bureau no longer had to convince the public. The culture had convinced itself. A film financed by moral reformers and amplified by exploitation cinema had done what years of hearings couldn't. It made fear familiar. That is the irony history rarely admits. The fiction worked because it felt like evidence. Tell Your Children mimicked the rhythms of journalism, the urgency of headlines, the tone of a courtroom, the structure of testimony. It made imagination sound official. Audiences didn't experience entertainment. They absorbed instruction. When the lights came up, the myth walked out with them, repeated at dinner tables, church sermons, and city meetings. By the time Congress convened, the narrative was already public record. Harry Anslinger recognized the power of that convergence. To him, reefer madness wasn't exaggeration. It was vindication. The film had visualized the very world he'd been describing. A nation in peril, youth on the brink, salvation through enforcement. He didn't need to control Hollywood. He just needed to let it echo. The less it looked coordinated, the more authentic it seemed. And authenticity, even when built on fear, is the most persuasive illusion of all. In Washington, the Bureau began drafting what it considered the final act, a piece of legislation that would translate narrative into law. The film had done its work. Now, the policy would make it permanent. When the Marihuana Tax Act was introduced in early 1937, there was no outcry, no demand for study. The public mood was already set. Lawmakers entered the hearing rooms thinking they were reacting to crisis, not realizing they were formalizing a script written in celluloid. This is how a myth matures. First, culture rehearses it. Then, law records it. The transition from fear to policy happens quietly, beneath the surface of agreement. When people believe they're protecting morality, they rarely notice the machinery behind it. Anslinger hadn't just built a bureau. He had built a world view, one that taught Americans to mistake storytelling for truth, emotion for evidence, and enforcement for safety. It was a lesson that would last generations. The next act begins in those congressional rooms of 1937, where the myth was given its final form. The cameras were gone, the speeches polished, the outcomes certain. What started as performance was about to become statute. The year is 1937, and the echo of reefer madness still lingers across America. In Washington, the House Ways and Means Committee meets under the hum of ceiling fans and the smell of fresh ink. This isn't a trial, it's a ritual. Harry Anslinger steps forward with a briefcase full of clippings, polished like relics, his voice steady from years of repetition. Marijuana, he tells the chamber, is the most violence-producing drug in the history of mankind. No one asks for data. Few even know what the word means. The committee, made up mostly of tax lawmakers rather than scientists, listens as though hearing testimony from the pulpit. Anslinger offers not studies, but stories, anecdotes of murder, insanity, and despair drawn from the Bureau's archive of headlines. Each one lands like scripture, emotional, unverifiable, and perfectly timed. The Marijuana Tax Act is framed as a regulatory measure, a technical tax designed to monitor sales. Beneath its bureaucratic phrasing lies the same moral logic that animated Tell Your Children: purity through restriction, salvation through control. It is not a debate about science. It is a reaffirmation of faith disguised as fiscal policy. When Dr. William C. Woodward, legislative counsel for the American Medical Association, finally rises to speak, the tone shifts. Calm but firm, he warns the committee that the Bureau's evidence is anecdotal, that physicians have not been consulted, that the plant's medical uses remain poorly understood. There is no scientific basis for these sweeping claims, he says, his voice almost drowned by the murmurs. Within minutes, he is accused of obstruction. One congressman snaps, "Doctor, you are defending something indefensible." The hearing moves on. Outside the chamber, the newspapers echo only the headlines the Bureau feeds them. Congress acts to halt drug menace. The public believes action has been taken against chaos. Few realize the bill originated from the Treasury Department rather than health authorities, or that almost no scientific testimony was recorded. On August 2nd, 1937, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the act into law. It goes into effect on October 1st. Within days, the first arrests take place in Denver. Moses Baca and Samuel Caldwell, two working-class men caught in the dragnet of a statute few citizens have ever heard of. Baca receives 18 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Caldwell gets 4 years of hard labor. Their names appear in local papers as the first victories in a newly declared moral crusade. If Anslinger's campaign had been a sermon, the Marihuana Tax Act was its scripture. It turned fear into statute, rhetoric into record. Bureaucracy had learned to speak the language of faith, and the nation mistook belief for law. For Anslinger, it was triumph. For America, it was inheritance. The ink dried quickly, but its reach spread slow. Across the country, pharmacists quietly removed cannabis tinctures from their shelves. Farmers abandoned hemp fields they'd tended for generations, uncertain whether the plant was now contraband or crop. Doctors, unsure of what remained legal, simply stopped prescribing it. There were no protests, no debates in the streets, just quiet compliance. Bureaucracy doesn't need applause, it only needs obedience. In the Treasury building, Harry Anslinger read the morning papers with the composure of a man who believed history had proved him right. His mission was complete. Yet, what he built wasn't a resolution. It was a machine. The press clippings, the case files, the film, and finally, the law, all of them together formed a closed circuit of conviction. The myth no longer required him to speak. It now spoke for itself. For the first time, the Bureau existed without question. Fear had become function. What began as a campaign for funding had evolved into an institution of belief. Anslinger's language, polished through repetition, would outlive his tenure, his logic encoded in every policy that followed. The government no longer needed to justify why it feared. The fear had become self-sustaining. No one in 1937 could see what had been set in motion. The Marijuana Tax Act seemed narrow, almost procedural. But the architecture of the policy, the merging of moral panic, racial bias, and administrative convenience, would echo far beyond its text. Its logic resurfaced decades later in the Boggs Act, the Controlled Substances Act, and the global treaties that exported America's drug war overseas. Anslinger's sermon had gone international. A few voices of the time saw the fault lines forming. Editorials in smaller papers questioned the rush, warning that hysteria is a poor foundation for law. Jazz musicians joked bitterly about the new arrests. Physicians whispered that a medical tool had been buried under politics. But those voices never aligned into resistance. They were scattered, isolated, drowned in headlines that promised safety and order. That was the genius and the tragedy of 1937. The nation didn't outlaw cannabis out of evidence or necessity. It did so out of faith. Faith in authority, faith in order, faith that the unknown was dangerous and the familiar righteous. The Bureau had given fear a purpose, and the country mistook it for protection. History would later remember reefer madness as propaganda, but for the people who lived through it, it wasn't fiction. It was confirmation of what they'd already been taught to believe. That is how myths survive, not through force, but through familiarity. Nearly a century later, we still live in the residue of that belief. Each debate, each law, each cautious reform still carries a shadow of 1937, a year when imagination became legislation and compliance replaced curiosity. That's where it began, not in a laboratory or a back alley, but in offices, headlines, and belief. A nation taught to trust its fears instead of its facts. 90 years later, we are still unlearning that lesson. One document, one law, one myth at a time. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about accountability. Because the past isn't gone, it's just been refiled under new names. If you made it to the end of part 1, you've already done what most don't. You've stayed through the quiet parts, the uncomfortable truths, the context that doesn't fit into headlines. That's what we do here. We don't glamorize the plant, and we don't sanitize the history. We study how culture, law, and language built the framework we live in today. This program is for educational and historical analysis only. It does not promote, encourage, or instruct the use, cultivation, or sale of cannabis or any controlled substance. All information presented is based on verified archival sources, public records, and academic research. Viewer discretion is advised for historical material that may include outdated or discriminatory language reflective of its era. Canna Intel 420 operates within all applicable state and federal laws. This content is produced solely for lawful educational commentary under fair use principles. Always follow your local and federal regulations before engaging in any cannabis-related activity. All narration, ambient sounds, and musical scoring in this video were created or enhanced using licensed, royalty-free, or AI-generated tools for educational purposes. No sound, dialogue, or depiction in this program represents real consumption or illegal activity. Canna Intel 420. Where culture meets compliance, we break the myth